Everyone in Black Ridge Valley saw a desperate widow throwing her last dollar at 20 broken-down mules nobody else would touch. The bank called it a bad investment. Her neighbors called it a breakdown. Her own brother-in-law told her straight to her face that she'd lost her mind. But Meredith Holloway wasn't buying animals. She was buying a theory, a half-mad, beautiful, terrifying theory that somewhere beneath the flooded bottomland rotting at the back of her grandfather's property lay the richest soil in the entire valley, and that the only way to reach it was on the backs of 20 creatures every sensible person had already written off as worthless. She was 40 years old, 2 years into widowhood, 3 months behind on a loan that was eating her farm alive, and she had just made the most expensive bet of her life. If you've ever watched someone do something that looked completely crazy and secretly hoped they were right, stay with this story. Like this video, drop a comment and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning Meredith bought the mules, the sky over Black Ridge Valley was the color of old dishwater. Flat, gray, and promising nothing good. She'd driven out to the picket auction yard before dawn, which was how she'd intended it. No one from town would be there at that hour, not on a Tuesday, not for a livestock sale that the auction house had practically apologized for in its own printed notice. Miscellaneous draft animals, various condition, no warranty expressed or implied. That was the language they'd used. She'd read it 3 times in the back office of her kitchen, with a cup of coffee gone cold beside her hand. 20 mules. The picket yard smelled the way all livestock yards smell. Manure, hay, old wood, and something underneath it all that was less a smell than a feeling, a kind of animal restlessness that pressed at the edges of a person. Meredith had grown up around that smell. She didn't mind it. She walked down the row of pens in the thin early light, with her hands in her jacket pockets, and looked at each animal in turn. They were not impressive. She'd known they wouldn't be. The tallest one had a sway to its back that suggested years of heavy hauling and not enough rest. One of the younger ones, still half colt in the face, still filling out, stood in the corner of its pen chewing nothing and watching her with large, flat, intelligent eyes. Several of them had the look of animals that had been moved around too many times, owned by too many different people, never quite settled. "You the Holloway woman?" She turned around. The man coming toward her was short, weathered the way wood gets when it's been left outside too long, with a nose that had been broken at least once and a clipboard tucked under one arm. "I am," she said. "Dale Pickett." He didn't extend a hand, just looked at her. "You called ahead." "I did." "You said you wanted the lot." "I do." He studied her for a second. "These aren't plow horses, Mrs. Holloway. Half of them have never been worked more than light utility. You got some kind of specialized use for mules?" "I do," she said again. He waited, clearly expecting more. She didn't give it to him. "All right," he said after a moment, making a note on his clipboard. "Price I quoted you stands. I'll need a transport arrangement by end of week. I have my own trailer. 1 trailer. I'll make 3 trips." He looked at her over the clipboard. "That's a lot of driving." "I've noticed," she said. "Twug." She made all 3 trips that day, which meant she didn't get back to the Holloway farm until past 8 in the evening, by which point her arms ached from the driving and her back was doing something unpleasant along the left side. She backed the last trailer through the gate in the dark, using only the truck's taillights and a flashlight she'd propped against a fence post, and she did it without any help because there was no one there to help her. That had been true for 2 years now. Garrett Holloway had died of a heart attack at 44, which the doctor said happened sometimes with men who worked the way Garrett worked, hard and constant, and never quite stopping long enough to notice what their body was trying to tell them. He'd been in the North Field at the time, cutting hay on the old baler that they'd meant to replace for the past 3 seasons. The hired man, Tommy Kress, had found him at dusk when he didn't come in for supper. Tommy had called Meredith from the field. She remembered standing in the kitchen with the phone against her ear and the pot of beans on the stove still bubbling, and the way the evening light looked coming through the window over the sink, golden and ordinary, and completely indifferent to what was happening. She'd cried after. She wasn't a person who didn't cry, but she hadn't fallen apart, which had surprised peoples. Or bothered them, she was never entirely sure which. Garrett's sister Pauline had come for the service and stayed 2 weeks longer than Meredith had wanted, circling her with the kind of concern that felt more like suspicion. You're not eating enough. You're not sleeping enough. You're not grieving the right way. Meredith had nodded through all of it and waited for her to go home. The farm was what had kept her upright. Not sentiment, practicality. There were animals to feed, fences to check, bills that arrived with complete indifference to personal tragedy. She'd let Tommy Cress go after the first winter because she couldn't pay him what he deserved, and she refused to pay him less. And she'd spent the year since learning to do alone what two people had managed before. That was the year she'd also started going through her grandfather's things. Edgar Holloway had died when Meredith was 11, which meant she'd known him just long enough to understand that he was unusual without being old enough to understand how. He'd farmed this land for 40 years before a stroke took him, and he'd left behind a farmhouse full of accumulated paper, ledgers, seed catalogs, bills of sale, correspondence with agricultural extension offices, weather logs going back 3 decades. Most of it was exactly what it appeared to be. But tucked in the back of the top drawer of his roll-top desk, beneath a bundle of letters tied with kitchen twine, she'd found a journal. It was a standard composition book, the kind you'd buy at any hardware store in 1948, with a black marbled cover and lines faded to pale gray. The handwriting was her grandfather's. She recognized it from his letters, tight and careful, the handwriting of a man who'd taught himself to write as an adult, and had never quite lost the deliberate quality of that effort. She'd started reading it one February night with the snow coming down outside and the wood stove doing its best, and she'd been nearly 2 hours in before she'd understood what she was reading. It wasn't a farming journal, or rather it was, but not in the way she'd expected. Her grandfather hadn't been recording yields and weather and livestock numbers. He'd been working something out, a problem he'd been sitting with for years, turning it over, coming at it from different angles, trying to find the shape of a solution. The problem was the bottomland. Black Ridge Valley sat in a crease between 2 long ridges, and the valley floor ran roughly north to south along a creek called Shale Branch that had the look of a gentle waterway and the behavior of a much more complicated one. The lower end of the valley, what the old maps called the bottomland, had been prime agricultural ground once, or so the older farmers claimed. Rich black soil, good moisture retention, the kind of ground that rewarded a farmer for simply showing up. But sometime in the 1930s, something had changed. The old drainage system, a network of clay tiles laid by hand in the 1890s, running beneath the valley floor in a pattern that Meredith's grandfather described with something close to reverence, had begun to fail. Individual tiles collapsed. The junction that connected the whole system to its outlet had given way under the pressure of a particularly wet spring, and water that should have moved through the ground in a controlled way had instead begun to pool. Over the years, the bottomland had become what it was now, 240 acres of saturated ground that a man could walk across only in the driest part of summer, and even then with his boots pulling at each step. Nobody farmed it. Nobody tried to. The machines sank. The cost of proper drainage work, the kind that would require excavating the old tile system and rebuilding the junction, was simply too high for any individual farmer to justify, especially when good dryland ground was available. Edgar Holloway had spent 30 years trying to solve it. The journal laid out his thinking in careful stages. He'd mapped the likely location of the old tile system from county survey records. He'd estimated the depth of the failed junction based on the drainage patterns he'd observed over decades. He'd calculated, in his painstaking hand, the approximate amount of labor and materials that would be needed to restore the system, not rebuild it from scratch, which would be prohibitively expensive, but locate the specific point of failure and address it surgically, the way a doctor might repair a blocked artery rather than replacing the whole circulatory system. The problem was always the same: access. Getting equipment into the bottomland was impossible. The ground was too soft. Every farmer who'd looked at it had reached the same conclusion. There was no way to get machinery into position, and without machinery, the work was simply too much for human hands. But Edgar Holloway had ended his journal with something that wasn't a conclusion exactly. It was more like a hypothesis he'd never had the chance to test. He'd written it in his careful, deliberate hand, with the kind of flatness that suggested he'd turned the idea over a long time before committing it to paper. The right draft animal wouldn't sink. The soil isn't uniformly weak. There's a path through it. I've walked pieces of it myself, in dry years. A mule, rightly trained, would find it. They always find the way a man can't see. Meredith had sat with that for a long time. She hadn't told anyone what she was thinking. She'd learned in the 2 years since Garrett died that there was a particular kind of social cost to sharing an unconventional idea before you had any evidence to support it. People didn't argue with you. They worried about you, which was worse. She'd seen it happen with old Gene Varney, who'd proposed a different corn rotation to the county extension office 3 years ago and spent 6 months being gently managed by people who thought he was losing his grip. She hadn't even told her sister Ellen, who was the person she trusted most in the world and who would still have looked at her with that particular expression, the one that meant "I love you, and I think you might be going off the rails." She'd done her research quietly. She'd gone to the county land office and pulled every survey record she could find on the bottomland. She'd found, in the archives of the local historical society, a set of photographs from the 1920s showing the valley before the drainage failure, field after field of corn and sorghum running all the way to the tree line, the land flat and dark and clearly productive. She'd found the original survey of the tile drainage system, hand-drawn on oilskin paper, annotated in 2 different hands across several decades. She'd found, most importantly, the location of the central drainage junction. According to the survey, it was buried approximately 9 feet below the surface of the bottomland, at a point roughly 100 yards from the eastern tree line, beneath a slight rise in the ground that was barely noticeable but that her grandfather had marked in his journal as a reference point. The rise was still visible. She'd walked out there twice in dry weather, in the late fall, when the ground was at its firmest, and she'd confirmed it. The junction was there. The system was intact except for the one failure point. If the junction could be accessed, if it could be repaired, water would begin moving again. The tile system would do the rest, the way it had done for 60 years before it failed. The question had always been, how do you get to it? 20 mules, she'd thought. The problem with the idea wasn't that it was wrong. The problem was that it required things she didn't yet have, and it required her to make a very large commitment before those things existed. The mules had to be trained to work together, in harness, on uncertain ground. She'd need to rebuild the old drag sled her grandfather had mentioned in the journal, a wide, flat platform designed to distribute weight across a larger surface area, exactly the way a person spreads their weight with snowshoes on ice. She'd need tools and materials for the drainage repair itself, none of which she owned. She'd need to get an engineer to advise her on what exactly was required to fix the junction. She wasn't a drainage engineer, and she couldn't afford to guess. And she was doing all of this 3 months behind on a farm loan at a moment when the bank holding that loan was not known for its patience. The loan officer at First Valley Bank was a man named Gerald Fitch, who had the kind of careful politeness that functioned as a threat. He wore the same style of gray suit every time she saw him, slightly shiny at the elbows. And he always had a pen in his hand that he didn't use to write anything, just held. He'd called her twice in the past month. She'd returned both calls and listened to him not quite say what he meant, which was that the bank was watching and that her situation was precarious and that she should perhaps consider her options. She told him she was working on it. She'd meant it when she said it. She just hadn't expected his definition of working on it, and hers to diverge quite as far as they apparently were going to. News of the mule purchase reached town approximately 48 hours after she'd made it, which was about as fast as news could travel in Black Ridge Valley. By the time she drove in for feed and supplies that Thursday, it had already been discussed, refined, embellished, and served back to her in several different flavors. At the feed store, Hank Dryard, who had farmed the ridgeland north of town for 30 years and considered himself an authority on most agricultural subjects, leaned on the counter and watched her fill out her order with the expression of a man who has already arrived at his conclusions. "Heard you bought Pickett's mule lot," he said. "Yep," she said. "All of them." "That's right." He was quiet for a moment, working at something with his tongue. 20 mules is a lot of mules, Meredith. "I've noticed," she said, using the same phrase she'd used on Dale Pickett, though with somewhat less patience. "What do you intend to do with 20 mules?" She looked up from the order form. Hank was watching her with genuine curiosity, mixed with the particular flavor of concern that she'd come to recognize as meaning. "I think you are about to make a decision I will later tell people I tried to warn you about." "Work," she said. "Work what? You've got 200 acres of dry land. You don't need mules for that. You barely need the equipment you've got. I've got more than 200 dry land acres, he paused. The bottomland. She wrote down the last item on her order and slid it across the counter. 1,200 pounds of mixed grain and 2 bales of good hay per mule, weekly. I'll need that to start Thursday. Meredith? His voice had shifted. Less curiosity now, more the flattened tone of genuine concern. That ground is underwater, has been my whole life. Nobody's farmed it since before your grandfather. You can't... I didn't say I was farming it yet, she said. She picked up her copy of the order. I said I was working it. The conversation she'd been dreading more was with her brother-in-law, Dale, who drove out to the farm that Saturday unannounced, which was his habit when he had something to say that he suspected she might not want to hear in a public setting. Dale Holloway was Garrett's younger brother, and he shared Garrett's broad build without Garrett's temperament. Garrett had been a patient man, sometimes maddeningly so. Dale was not. He came through the gate and found her in the paddock behind the barn, where she'd started the slow business of introducing the mules to each other and to her, which required nothing more complicated than standing among them and letting them get used to her presence. Meredith, he said, stopping at the fence. Dale! She didn't look up. She was scratching the base of the young mule's ear, the one with the watchful eyes, and he'd lowered his head, leaning into it slightly with the cautious pleasure of an animal that hadn't been handled kindly in a while. Those the mules from Pickett's? They are. How much did you pay for them? She straightened up. That's between me and Dale Pickett. Meredith. He put both hands on the top rail of the fence. I talked to Gerald Fitch. She turned around then. Why did you do that? Because I'm worried about you. He met her eyes, and she could see that he meant it. That the worry was genuine, not calculated. That didn't make her feel better. Genuine concern that arrives uninvited still arrives uninvited. You're 3 months behind. The bank is talking about... I know what the bank is talking about, she said. Gerald Fitch has made himself very clear. Then you understand that this... He gestured at the paddock, at the 20 mules standing in various attitudes of indifference, is not the moment for experiments. I understand what you think, she said. I'm trying to help you. I know you are. She walked to the fence and stopped about 6 feet from him, close enough that the conversation was clearly between them and not happening at a distance. And I'm telling you, as clearly as I can, that I have thought about this for a long time, and I have a plan, and I intend to work it. If the bank comes for the property before I can turn this around, then I'll deal with that. But I'm not going to do nothing while I wait to find out. He looked at her for a long moment. Behind her, one of the mules snorted softly. What plan? He asked. She'd intended to say nothing. She'd held to that intention for months, through all the research, through all the quiet calculations, through every doubtful conversation in town. But something about the way Dale was looking at her, not the skepticism, but underneath it, the residual shape of Garrett in his face, the slight similarity they shared around the eyes, made her change her mind. She told him about the journal, about the tile system, about what her grandfather had written. She told him about the junction. Dale listened without interrupting, which was not his usual habit. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. You think 20 mules can do what tractors can't, he said. I think they can go where tractors can't, she said, which is different. Once we can reach the junction, once you can reach the junction, he corrected. Once I can reach it, she agreed. The repair is a different kind of problem, a solvable one. He shook his head slowly, but she noticed he wasn't laughing. Who's going to help you with the engineering side? You can't fix a failed junction if you don't know what you're fixing. I'm working on that, she said. She was, in fact, working on it, though she hadn't yet found her way to a solution. The county extension office had been her first call. The man she'd spoken to, young, cheerful, distressingly knowledgeable about the limits of his own expertise, had told her that drainage engineering of the kind she was describing fell outside the Extension Service's purview, and that she'd want to speak with a licensed engineer who specialized in agricultural drainage. He'd given her 3 names. She'd called all 3. The first 2 had been politely uninterested after she'd explained the access situation. No vehicle access, pack-in work only, a 9-foot excavation required in saturated ground. The third had quoted her a site assessment fee that was more than she'd paid for the mules. She'd set the problem aside, which was what she did with problems that weren't immediately solvable. She put them on a mental shelf and left them there until something came loose or a new piece of information changed the shape of things. The new piece of information came from an unlikely direction. She'd been in the public library in early March, going through old issues of the Valley Courier, the weekly newspaper that had been running in Blackridge for 60 years, looking for any coverage of the original drainage failure in the 1930s. She'd found it, eventually, a brief item from 1938, 2 paragraphs, noting that the spring floods had damaged the drainage system in the lower valley and that repair costs were being estimated. The item named the man who'd originally designed the system in the 1890s, a drainage engineer named Thomas Vance, and noted that his grandson, one Elias Granger, had recently consulted with county officials about the failure. Elias Granger. She'd thought she knew that name. It took her 3 days to remember where she'd heard it. Elias Granger had worked for the county road department for 30 years before retiring. She'd met him exactly once, at a barbecue at the Calhoun place maybe 5 years ago, when Garrett was still alive. She remembered him as a compact, quiet man in his late 70s who'd sat at the end of a table and watched the proceedings with eyes that missed very little. She remembered Garrett mentioning afterward that Granger had worked on every significant drainage project in the county for 3 decades, and that the road department had let him go when they consolidated with the next county over, and that it had been a loss nobody had quite acknowledged. She'd found his address in the county directory. She'd driven out there on a Wednesday afternoon in March with no more plan than to knock on the door. Elias Granger's house sat on the edge of a small property north of town, a clean, spare white farmhouse with a front porch and a large vegetable garden, still dormant, showing the carefully laid out beds of someone who takes their gardening seriously. There was a truck in the drive, an old blue Chevy, and a stacked wood pile under a lean-to that looked like enough to get through 2 winters. She knocked, waited. The door opened and Elias Granger looked at her from behind the screen. He was older than she remembered. Somewhere past 80 now, she thought, with white hair worn short and a face that had compressed itself around strong bones over the years. He wore a flannel shirt and had reading glasses pushed up on his forehead. "Mr. Granger," she said, "I don't know if you remember me. I'm Meredith Holloway, Edgar Holloway's granddaughter." He studied her for a moment. "I remember you," he said. "You were at the Calhoun place a few years ago. Your husband passed." 2 years ago, she said. "Yes. What do you want?" No preamble, no social lubricant. She appreciated it. "I want to talk to you about the drainage tile system in the lower Holloway bottomland," she said, "and what it would take to repair it." He was quiet for a moment. Then he unlatched the screen door and pushed it open. "Come in," he said. They sat at his kitchen table with coffee that he made without asking if she wanted any, just put the pot on, set 2 cups out, and sat down while it brewed. The kitchen was orderly in the way of a person who lives alone and has settled into precise habits, everything in its place, a rack of tools by the back door, a stack of books and papers on one corner of the table pushed aside to make room. She laid out the survey on the table. She'd brought a photocopy, not the original, and her grandfather's notes, and the photographs from the Historical Society. He didn't say anything while he looked at them. He was quiet for a long time. She noticed he put on his reading glasses without moving his face much, sliding them down from his forehead with a practiced motion. "This survey is from 1893, he said. "Yes. The tile work was done by Thomas Vance. I know, I read about him in an article from 1938, something about a flood that damaged the system." He nodded slowly. "The junction failed in the spring floods of 38. I was 9 years old. My grandfather had built that system. He was contracted by 3 families in the valley. It was good work. When it failed, there wasn't money to fix it. Depression years." He paused. "People kept meaning to come back to it. Nobody ever did." "No." He looked at the survey again. "This junction here." He pointed. "That's the one. According to my grandfather's notes, it's 9 feet down, roughly here." She indicated the mark on the survey. He estimated he'd identified the point from surface drainage patterns. Granger was quiet for a moment. "Your grandfather was right," he said. She looked up. "I did a bore survey on that parcel in 1971, he said. "County asked me to look at it, Back when there was talk about a public drainage project. Nothing came of it. Budget got cut. But I put boreholes at 6 locations across that bottomland. One of them was 20 feet from where Edgar Holloway put that mark. He tapped the photocopy with one finger. The clay tile was intact at 8.5 feet. The junction chamber was 6 feet further on. There was water pooled in the chamber. The inlet tiles were blocked, and the outlet was completely collapsed. Meredith felt something in her chest that was not quite excitement and not quite fear, but had elements of both. "Can it be fixed?" she asked. He picked up his coffee cup, held it without drinking. "Depends what you mean by fixed," he said. "The tile system itself is likely intact. Clay tile from the 1890s, good clay, laid by a man who knew what he was doing, it'll still be whole in most places. What failed was the junction. The junction chamber needs to be rebuilt and the outlet extended. It's not complicated work. It's just deep, wet, and difficult to reach. The ground is too soft for equipment. Has been for years. What if I could reach it with draft animals," she said. "Mules hauling a work sled. If I could get materials and tools to the site, is the repair itself within the range of what 2 people could do?" He put his coffee cup down, looked at her. "How many mules?" 20. He was quiet for a moment. 20 mules, properly worked, could haul enough stone and tile and equipment for the repair, yes. If they could reach the site. He paused. "The ground is soft, but it's not uniformly soft. There's a firmer path along the eastern edge. The survey shows a slight elevation change. A mule wouldn't sink there the way a tractor would." "My grandfather wrote something similar," she said, "in his journal." Elias Granger looked at her for a long moment across the table. Something shifted in his expression. Not warmth exactly, but a kind of careful reassessment. "What are you asking me?" he said. "I'm asking if you'd be willing to advise the repair," she said. "Come out, consult. Tell me what I'm looking at when we get down to the junction. I can't pay you what you're worth, but I can offer you something." He waited. "If the drainage works," she said, "and that bottomland becomes productive ground, I'll set aside 20 acres of it, recorded and titled, for you to farm however you see fit, for as long as you want it." Elias Granger sat with that for a while. Outside, a wind came through and pressed against the window glass. "When do you want to start?" he said. "Yet." Spring in Black Ridge Valley was unpredictable, and the spring that Meredith Holloway set to work on the problem of the bottomland was no exception. March came in cold and stayed cold, with a series of late storms that pushed her preliminary work back 3 weeks. She used the time. The mules were the first project. 20 animals that had come from 20 different situations, different handling, different training, different experience with people, did not become a working team overnight. She'd known that. What she hadn't fully calculated was the degree to which 20 was a specific number with its own logic, and the number of individual relationships implied in that figure. There was the young one, the one with the watchful eyes. She'd started calling him 7 because he'd been 7th in her feeding rotation, and the name had stuck before she'd thought to give him a better one. 7 was smart, almost inconveniently so. He watched everything, processed everything, and had opinions about the things he processed. He was also deeply skeptical, which she could not hold against him because she suspected he had earned that skepticism. There was an older mule she called Ruth, broad across the shoulders, with a calm that was not passivity, but something more like authority. Ruth had an effect on the younger animals that Meredith came to rely on. When Ruth was calm, the others steadied. When Ruth was uncertain, it rippled outward. There were others, a pair of matched grays she thought of as the brothers, though she wasn't sure they were actually related. A rangy sorrel with a habit of testing the fence line that she named Problem Solver because it was either that or something unprintable. A quiet, older female with a scarred shoulder who moved with a slight favoring gait in cold weather and who Meredith brought into the barn on the coldest nights without quite deciding to make a policy of it. She spent 2 hours a day simply being among them. Not training, exactly. Just presence. Letting them learn her rhythm, her smell, her consistency. She brought the same routine every day, at the same times, in the same order. Animals learned routines the way people learn music. First the shape of it, then the notes, then something that became involuntary. By the end of March, she could walk through the paddock without any of them moving away. By mid-April, she had Ruth in harness. The drag sled was her grandfather's design, adapted. She'd found a sketch of it in the back of the journal, a wide, flat platform, roughly 12 feet by 6, built on runners rather than wheels, designed to sit low to the ground and spread its load across the maximum possible surface area. Her grandfather had labeled it simply the float and noted its dimensions in his precise hand. She'd built it herself over 2 weekends with lumber from the mill and hardware from the farm supply. She was not a carpenter. The result was functional and ungraceful and completely solid, which was what she'd been aiming for. She'd loaded it with weight and dragged it across the south field behind Ruth, then behind Ruth, and 2 others, then behind a 5-mule hitch, watching how the sled tracked, how the animals responded to the shifting load, how the harness tension distributed. It worked. She'd called Elias Granger the evening of the first successful full-team haul. He'd listened to her account without much commentary. "What's the going like at the edge of the bottomland?" he asked. "Firm enough for the approach," she said. "I haven't taken them further in yet." "Take it slow," he said. "The first time you send 1 mule ahead, watch where it puts its feet. Where it hesitates, you stop." "I know," she said. "You may not know which one to send ahead," he said. She looked out the kitchen window at the barn, where the faint movement of the mules was just visible in the last of the evening light. "I know which one," she said. Seven looked up when she said his name, in the barn, 3 mornings later, as if he'd been waiting. The first crossing of the bottomland was in early May, a Tuesday, with the morning cool and the sky clear and the ground at its spring driest. She'd told no one it was happening. She'd driven out with Elias Granger, who'd accepted a ride without comment and sat in the passenger seat of her truck with a notebook on his knee. And they'd gone through the gate at the bottom field and stopped at the edge of the cattails where the good ground ended and the wet ground began. She'd unlatched Seven from the trailer and walked him to the edge. He'd stood there for a moment, looking at it. She'd given him time. Then he'd stepped forward. She'd watched where his feet went. She'd followed. Behind them, one at a time, the other mules. An hour later, they were standing at the rise in the ground. The slight, barely perceptible elevation that her grandfather had marked in his journal, that Elias Granger had bored through in 1971, that 2 generations of farmers had walked past without understanding what lay beneath it. Granger climbed down from the sled, moved to the rise, and pressed the heel of his boot into the earth. 9 feet, he said. It wasn't a question. He said it the way a person says something they've always known. Meredith stood beside him in the May morning, with 20 mules standing patient and warm behind her, and looked at the ground. 240 acres, the richest soil in the valley, 60 years of sitting underwater, waiting. "We've got work to do," she said. The filing of the repair project with county records, and the first conversation with Gerald Fitch about a restructured payment timeline were 2 separate pieces of business that she handled the following Monday, back in town, in the same day. She didn't think they were related. Gerald Fitch clearly disagreed. "You're telling me you've reached the junction," he said, his pen moving for once, writing something down. "With mules." "With mules," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said the thing she hadn't expected. "I'd like to come out and see it." "All right," she said. She wasn't sure yet what to make of that, but she'd learned to keep moving forward when something unexpected opened up, and file the uncertainty for later. She had a drainage junction to repair. Gerald Fitch came out on a Thursday. He drove his own car, a clean gray sedan that looked deeply uncomfortable on the rutted farm road, and he arrived exactly on time, which Meredith had expected. He stepped out wearing his usual gray suit and looked at the barn, the paddock, the 20 mules watching him from behind the fence rail, and then at Meredith. "You walked them across," he said. Not a question. She'd told him that already, over the phone. But there was a difference between hearing something and standing in a place where that thing had happened, and she could see him recalibrating. "We've made 6 crossings," she said. "We know the path now. The mules know it better than I do at this point." Fitch looked at the paddock again. Seven was standing at the fence closest to the newcomer, watching him with that steady, measuring attention he gave to everything unfamiliar. "That one's staring at me," Fitch said. "He does that," she said. "Come on." She walked him down to the bottomland edge, which she could do now without thinking about her footing, and stood with him at the point where the firm ground ended and the cattails began. The May morning was warm, and the wet smell of the bottomland came up clearly, not unpleasant, just heavy with standing water and old vegetation and the particular mineral quality of ground that hadn't moved freely in decades. 240 acres, he said. 243 according to the original survey. He was quiet for a moment. And you believe this drainage repair will make that ground farmable? I don't believe it, she said. The soil tests I've had done confirm the quality. The drainage engineer I'm working with confirms the feasibility. It's not belief. It's engineering. Fitch looked at her sideways. Who's the engineer? Elias Granger. She watched him process that. Fitch was roughly her age, mid-40s, which meant he'd have known Granger by reputation at best. Old man who used to work for the county road department, retired, probably considered past it by people who assessed a person's value by how recently they'd last drawn a professional paycheck. Is he licensed? Fitch asked. He's the most qualified person in this county to advise on this specific repair, she said. His grandfather built the system. He surveyed it himself in 1971. There is no one on this earth who knows more about what's under that ground than Elias Granger. Fitch said nothing. He had his hands in his pockets, which was unusual. He normally held that pen. He was looking out at the bottomland, at the flat sheet of water reflecting the sky between the stands of cattail and sedge grass. How long for the repair, he said. Granger estimates 4 to 6 weeks of active work once we've cleared the excavation site. Call it 8 weeks total with weather and access variables. And if it works, that ground will drain over a full growing season. By next spring, we'll have dry enough conditions to disc and plant. Fitch turned and looked at her directly. He had a banker's face, not unkind, but trained to neutrality in a way that made it difficult to read. If the soil tests are what you say, and if this drainage works the way you're describing, that acreage would more than cover the outstanding loan amount. By a considerable margin, she said. He nodded slowly. I need documentation. The soil assessment, the engineering opinion. Granger's credentials, current, not 30 years ago. The repair plan, timeline, cost estimates. I can have that to you by end of next week. End of next week, he repeated, like he was writing it in his head. Then he looked back at the bottomland one more time. Mrs. Holloway. Yes. The bank isn't in the business of wanting people to fail, he said. I know that might not be how it feels from where you're standing. She thought about what to say to that. She thought about the 2 phone calls and the careful politeness and the way he'd held his pen without writing anything down for 6 months. Bring me the documentation, he said. She did. What she hadn't told Fitch, what she hadn't told anyone, because it was the kind of problem that didn't improve under the weight of other people's concern, was that the path through the bottomland was narrower than she'd hoped. Seven had found it on the first crossing, and it was real. A firm enough strip of elevated ground running roughly along the eastern edge of the bottomland, just as her grandfather had written in his journal, and just as Granger had confirmed from his bore surveys. But narrow was the operative word. The path ran maybe 12 feet across at its widest point. The drag sled was 8 feet wide. The margin was not generous, and it changed slightly with the moisture levels in the surrounding ground, which changed with rainfall, which could not be controlled. She'd discovered the issue on the third crossing when the far right runner of the sled had gone soft. Not sinking exactly, but deflecting, the way a person's foot deflects on spongy ground, the sled listing slightly to the right with the load shifting with it. She'd stopped the team, walked the full length of the sled, checked the runners, and spent 20 minutes redistributing the weight before proceeding. No damage done. But the margin for error was smaller than she'd wanted it to be, and she'd spent the subsequent crossings watching the path with a level of focus that left her exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with physical labor. She hadn't told Granger about the listing either, which she recognized as a mistake even as she was making it. He found out on the 5th crossing because Elias Granger had been in drainage work for 40 years and had the habit, developed over decades of field work, of watching the ground the way a river pilot watches the water. Not for what was visible on the surface, but for what the surface was telling him about what lay beneath. "Stop," he said, about 2/3 of the way across without raising his voice. She stopped the team. He climbed down from the sled and walked to the right side and crouched over the runner. He pressed his hand flat against the ground beside it, looked up at her. You've been having trouble on this side, he said. Some. Since when? Third crossing. He stood up slowly with the careful deliberateness of someone whose knees had been asking him to slow down for several years. He looked at her steadily from under the brim of his hat. You need to tell me these things, he said. This is not a problem I can help with if I'm working from incomplete information. I didn't want to. She stopped. Didn't want to what? Make it into something bigger than it was, she said. He looked at her for a moment. Meredith, that runner going 2 inches soft on the right side is not a big problem. A runner going 2 inches soft that nobody mentions until it goes 6 inches soft is a different kind of problem. Do you understand the difference? Yes, she said. Good. He put his hands in his pockets. Now, walk me along the right edge. I want to see where it changes. The problem, as he explained it while they walked, was that the elevated path was not a natural feature of the terrain, but a remnant of the original drainage work, a slight crown of compacted fill that had been placed when the tile system was installed, designed to keep the junction access point above the waterline. Over 60 years of saturation, the fill had settled unevenly, and the right side had settled more than the left. It's not structural, he said. The tile is deep enough that it's not affected by surface settling, but we're going to need to repack this section before we try to haul any serious weight over it. He paused. Which means another trip across before the work trip. With what material? Gravel, he said. Fine packed, wet laid, 2 passes of the sled over it to set it. He looked at the path ahead of them. And we do it in sections, not all at once. You can't load the path beyond what the underlying ground will carry, or you're not solving the problem. You're just adding weight to it. She looked at the path, at the slight depression on the right side that she now saw clearly. This is going to add time, she said. Yes, he agreed. It's going to add 10 days minimum, probably 2 weeks. She calculated that against Fitch's timeline, against the loan, against the approaching summer heat that would make the excavation work harder as the weeks went on. All right, she said. She didn't like it, but she said it anyway because it was true. Ellen came out on a Saturday in late May, which was unusual. Ellen lived 40 minutes away in the county seat and generally called before driving out, because she respected the fact that a working farm had its own rhythms and dropping in unannounced disrupted them. The fact that she arrived without calling meant she'd been thinking about something long enough that the thinking had overtaken the courtesy. Meredith saw the car from the upper field and came down. Her sister was standing by the paddock fence watching the mules with an expression that mixed genuine interest with the particular caution of someone preparing to say something difficult. You look tired, Ellen said. I am tired, Meredith said. Do you want coffee? Yes. They went into the kitchen. Meredith poured and sat down across the table from her sister, and they were quiet for a moment in the easy way of people who have known each other their whole lives and don't require conversation to feel comfortable in the same room. Dale called me, Ellen said. Meredith wrapped her hands around her mug. Okay. He's worried. I know he's worried. He came out here and told me he was worried. He thinks you're going to lose the farm. I might, Meredith said. That's been true since Garrett died. It's not new information. Ellen looked at her steadily. She was 3 years older than Meredith, and she had their mother's eyes, dark, direct, with that quality of seeing what you were actually feeling rather than what you were presenting. It was sometimes useful and sometimes exhausting. Are you okay? Ellen said. Not worried okay. Not managing okay. Actually okay. Meredith thought about it honestly, the way she tried to think about most things. She was tired. The path repacking had taken 11 days, not 10, and the gravel supply had run short on the second pass, and she'd made an emergency run to the quarry by herself, loaded and unloaded by hand because the quarry's front loader was down for service. Her left shoulder still had opinions about that. She was 2 weeks behind on her originally estimated timeline, which put pressure on the summer window that she hadn't wanted to pressure. She'd been waking at 4 a.m. with a list of calculations running through her head that she couldn't shut off. I'm functional, she said. Ellen nodded. That's not the same thing. No, Meredith agreed. It's not. They were quiet for a moment. Outside, through the kitchen window, she could see the edge of the paddock and one of the mules, Ruth, probably, by the size and posture, standing in the morning shade. Tell me about it, Ellen said. The whole thing, from the beginning. Meredith looked at her. I told Dale. Tell me, Ellen said. Not the version where you're explaining to someone who doesn't believe you, the whole thing. So Meredith told her. The journal, the survey, the tile system, Granger and the boreholes from 1971, the mules and the path, and the problem with the right runner, the excavation plan, what they'd found, what Granger said they were looking for, the conversation with Fitch. Ellen listened the way she always had, without interrupting, without the small reactive expressions that most people couldn't suppress. She just listened, and when Meredith finished, she was quiet for a moment, turning her coffee mug slightly in her hands. You've been carrying this alone for a long time, she said. It was mine to carry, Meredith said. It doesn't have to be. Ellen, I'm not offering to fix it, her sister said. I'm not offering money. I don't have any to spare and you wouldn't take it anyway. I'm saying you can tell me things when they're hard. She paused. You don't have to show up as the person who has it all figured out. Not to me. Meredith looked at her coffee. Something in her chest was doing something she hadn't expected, a kind of loosening that she recognized as the particular relief of being seen by someone who actually knows you. The shoulder's bad, she said. I noticed, Ellen said. And the path problem scared me more than I let on, she said. When the runner went soft the third time, I stood there and ran the numbers in my head about what would happen if the sled went over on the crossing, with a full load, with the mules in harness, and She stopped, started again. It's a lot of weight, she said, moving over uncertain ground. If it goes wrong fast. But it didn't go wrong, Ellen said. Not yet. Ellen nodded. Not yet, she said, without any false reassurance to soften it. Just the words, just the reality. That was why Meredith had always trusted her more than anyone else. The excavation started on the first Monday of June. She'd been over the plan with Granger 4 times, not because she hadn't understood it after the second time, but because she had the habit, when dealing with something she couldn't afford to get wrong, of finding every possible point of failure before she reached it. Granger had the same habit, which was one of the things she'd come to appreciate about him. He didn't resent the repeated conversations. He used them to find new things to say. The excavation itself would be done by hand. There was no way around that. 2 people with long-handled spades and a shoring system made of timber and steel that they'd built in her barn over 2 weekends, bolted together in sections that could be assembled in the field. The mules would haul the timber sections across on the sled, and they'd assemble the shoring as they dug, which was standard practice for deep hand-dug excavations, and which Granger had done enough times to have strong opinions about the proper method. You start the shoring before you think you need it, he said, on the morning they began. Not when the walls look like they're going to move. Before, she repeated. The ground has been saturated for 60 years, he said. It looks solid when you're standing on it. It isn't. Don't trust it. She didn't. The first day they went down 3 feet, which Granger said was good for hand digging in wet ground, and set the first tier of shoring, and stopped when the afternoon light began to go, and her arms had reached the kind of tired where the muscles stopped being reliable. She climbed out of the excavation, straightened her back slowly, and looked at the hole they'd made in the earth. 3 feet down, 6 to go. How are you feeling? Granger said. He was standing at the edge, looking down, and he asked it in the way he asked most things, without particular inflection, like he wanted the actual answer rather than the social one. Like I dug 3 feet into wet ground with a hand spade, she said. Good, he said. That's the correct way to feel. He looked down at the hole. It's holding well, he said. The shoring's seated correctly. Come back tomorrow. She drove home. She made herself eat something, eggs and bread, the minimum required, and she sat for a while at the kitchen table with her grandfather's journal open in front of her, not reading it exactly, but looking at the handwriting, the careful, deliberate lines, the evidence of a man who'd thought about this same problem for 30 years. She wondered if he'd ever stood at the edge of a hole he'd just dug in that ground. Probably not. He'd been looking for a way in his whole farming life, and the way had never quite materialized. The mules had been part of it. She was certain of that now, reading the journal's final pages. He'd thought about draft animals, had believed they were the missing piece of the access problem, but he'd never gotten there. The stroke had come first. She closed the journal and put it on the shelf where she always kept it, and went to bed before 9 o'clock, which was the earliest she'd gone to sleep since she was a child. On the fourth day of digging, at approximately 7 feet down, Granger's spade hit something that made a sound that was not earth. He stopped, looked up at her. She was working the second half of the excavation, about 18 inches from him in the narrow space. She'd heard it too. "Tile," he said. He crouched, carefully, because the space didn't allow for much movement, and used a shorter-handled trowel to clear the earth around the point of contact. Clay tile, red-brown, still whole, running in a straight line at roughly a 45-degree angle to the direction of the excavation. He cleared 6 inches of it, then a foot, then followed it with his hands until it curved and joined another run of tile coming from a different direction. "We're at the junction," he said. The words were flat and ordinary and completely inadequate to the moment. Meredith stood in 9 feet of wet earth, her boots in 6 inches of water that had seeped in from the sides despite the shoring, her shoulder aching, her hands raw from days of digging, and looked at the tile work that Thomas Vance had laid in the ground more than 100 years ago. The clay was dark with age and moisture, but intact. She could see that clearly. The tiles were whole. The junction was exactly where Edgar Holloway and Elias Granger had both independently predicted it would be. "The collapse is here," Granger said, moving to the far side of the junction. He crouched again and cleared more earth. The tile on this side ran for about 2 feet and then simply ended. Not cleanly, but in a collapse. The tiles around the outlet broken inward, the exit passage filled with packed earth and debris. "That's the outlet," she said. "That's the outlet," he agreed. He was quiet for a moment, on his hands and knees in the mud, looking at 60 years of accumulated failure. "This is what happens when you get a hydrostatic pressure event and the outlet can't handle the load," he said. "The tiles failed inward, probably over the course of one wet season, and then the debris sealed it. Can we clear it?" He sat back on his heels and looked at the extent of the damage. The outlet passage had collapsed for roughly 3 feet. The tile was gone, replaced by packed earth and fragments of broken clay. "We rebuild it," he said. "We've got the replacement tiles on the sled. It's going to take a full day down here to set the new tiles and bed them properly, maybe 2. And we'll need to extend the outlet another 3 feet past the collapse point to clean ground." He paused. "It's doable. It's not fast." She looked at the broken outlet for a long moment. Outside the hole, somewhere above them, she could hear one of the mules shifting. The sound of hooves on firm ground, the jingle of harness hardware. 20 animals, patient as the earth itself, waiting. "Tell me how to start," she said. Granger looked at her. For just a moment, something in his face changed. The careful professional neutrality giving way to something older and quieter, an expression she didn't have a name for. "You clear the debris," he said. "By hand. Start at the break point and work outward. Every piece you remove, check it. If the tile fragment is larger than your fist, set it aside. We might be able to use it to bed the new work." She got back on her knees in the mud. She cleared debris for 3 hours. On the second day of tile work, with the new outlet extended and 2/3 bedded, Meredith made a mistake. She'd been tired, genuinely tired. Not the functional tired of the past weeks, but the deeper kind. The kind that gets into your judgment, the way water gets into old wood, slowly and without announcing itself. She set a tile at an angle that Granger had specified as 3 degrees and got 4 degrees, and he caught it before she mortared it in place, but the catching of it required pulling the adjacent tiles and resetting, which cost them an hour. She knew it immediately. She didn't say anything, just started pulling the tiles. Granger worked beside her in silence for a few minutes. Then he said, without accusation, "When did you last eat something?" She thought about it. "This morning?" "What?" "Coffee and a biscuit." He stopped working and looked at her. "Meredith, it's past 3 in the afternoon." "I know." She kept working. "I'll eat when we're done." "You'll eat now," he said. He climbed out of the excavation, which took him a while and cost him something. She could see it in the way he moved when he reached the top, standing carefully, catching his breath. He went to the sled, where she'd packed a canvas bag of supplies, and came back with 2 apples and a piece of cold cornbread wrapped in cloth. He lowered them down on the rope they'd been using for the smaller tools. "Eat," he said from above. "Then we finish." She ate. She didn't argue about it, because she was too tired to argue, and because he was right. She sat in 9 feet of damp earth with old clay tile all around her and ate an apple and a piece of cold cornbread, and she thought about her grandfather, and she thought about what it meant to spend 30 years trying to solve a problem you couldn't quite reach. She thought about the fact that she was, at this moment, sitting at the bottom of that problem. The thought didn't feel triumphant. It felt very quiet and very specific. The sensation of being exactly where you were supposed to be, doing exactly what the situation required, without any particular poetry to it. Just the work, and the ground, and the tiles, and the slow, irreversible progress of it. She finished the cornbread. She brushed the crumbs off her hands. "Okay?" she called up. "Okay," Granger said. She went back to work. They finished the outlet on the 3rd day of tile work, in the early afternoon, with a sky that had been threatening rain since morning and finally delivered on the threat as they were setting the last bedding course. It rained on them for 20 minutes, a moderate, indifferent summer rain that soaked her jacket and ran down the back of her neck, and neither of them stopped working. When the last tile was mortared and the bedding packed and the outlet mouth cleared to clean ground 3 feet beyond the collapse point, Granger stood in the bottom of the excavation and looked at it for a long moment without speaking. Then he said, "We backfill tomorrow. Let it cure overnight." "All right," she said. "In 3 to 5 days, you'll see the water level in the bottomland start to drop," he said. "It won't be dramatic at first, an inch a day maybe, then more as the system opens up." She nodded. "This is going to work," he said. It was not the voice of reassurance. It was the voice of assessment, the same voice he used to describe grades and flow rates and soil composition. "I want you to know that. It's going to work because it was designed correctly and built correctly, and you were patient enough not to rush the things that couldn't be rushed." She looked at the tile work. The clean new clay gleaming slightly in the wet light fitted precisely into the old system, bridging the 60 years between what Thomas Vance had built and what they had just repaired. "Your grandfather would have gotten here," Granger said. "He was working toward it." "I know," she said. "He just ran out of time." "I know that too," she said. They stood in the bottom of the hole together for another moment, and then Granger started toward the ladder and she followed, and they climbed out into the rain-washed afternoon with the bottomland stretching around them, quiet and still and full of water that, in 3 to 5 days, would begin, for the first time in 60 years, to move. The backfill took most of the following morning. They worked in reverse order, closing the excavation the same methodical way they'd opened it, removing shoring tiers from the bottom up, packing earth in lifts and tamping each one before adding the next. It was slower than digging had been, which struck Meredith as counterintuitive until Granger explained it. "You're not just filling a hole," he said, working the tamping bar with short, deliberate strokes. "You're re-establishing the load path over the repair. You fill it wrong. You put uneven pressure on the new tile work before the mortar's fully cured. You can crack what you just fixed." "So we go slow," she said. "We go slow," he agreed. By noon, the excavation was sealed. The ground where they'd been working looked disturbed, raw earth, darker than the surrounding soil, the kind of obvious disturbance that would take a full season to settle back into the landscape. She stood at the edge of it and felt the particular strange flatness that comes after a long effort concludes. Not satisfaction, exactly. More like the absence of the sustained tension she'd been carrying for weeks, which left a kind of hollowness where the tension had been. Granger was loading the last of the shoring timber onto the sled. He moved carefully, deliberately, with the economy of someone who has been managing the limits of his own body for years and has made a practical peace with it. She'd noticed over the weeks of working together that he never complained about the physical cost of what they were doing. He simply worked around it, paced himself differently than she did, rested when he needed to without making anything of it, and then returned to the work. "What now?" she said. "Now we wait," he said. 3 days minimum. Probably 5 before you see anything meaningful in the water level." She looked at the bottom land around them. The standing water was perfectly still in the June heat, reflecting the sky in patches between the cattails. It had looked this way her entire life, static, permanent, like something that had always been here and always would be. It was hard to believe that 9 feet below her boots, water was now moving through clay tiles laid by a dead man's grandfather. "You'll know it's working," Granger said, reading her, When the cattails at the center start to lean, they root differently in moving water than in standing water. You won't see the water level drop at first. The system has to pressurize, but the cattails will tell you before the tape measure does. She looked at him. How long did it take you to learn that? He considered it. 30 years, he said, give or take. She drove him home that afternoon, and on the way back she stopped at the feed store for supplies and walked into a conversation she hadn't been expecting. Hank Dreyer was there. He was always there, it sometimes seemed, planted behind the counter or in front of it. And with him was Roy Caulfield, who farmed the flat ground south of town and had never, in Meredith's experience, expressed a view on anything without first confirming that it was the prevailing view. Heard you finished digging, Hank said. She stopped. News travels. Dale mentioned it to somebody, Hank said. Not an apology, just a fact. In a valley this size, information moved the way water did, along the path of least resistance, without asking permission. Said you and old Granger were out there for 2 weeks with hand tools. That's right, she said. She moved to the counter and set down her list. Roy Caulfield was looking at her with an expression she'd seen before on his face, a sort of reluctant curiosity, like a man who wants to ask a question but hasn't decided yet whether asking it will require him to revise something he'd rather leave unrevised. The drainage, he said. If it works. When it works, she said. He paused at the correction. When it works. Does it affect anything upstream, the water table on the adjacent parcels? She'd thought about this. She'd asked Granger about it specifically. The system drains to Shale Branch, she said, same as it always did. The outlet is downstream of the adjacent parcels. Granger mapped the flow direction. The water table on the neighboring ground won't be affected because the tile system sits below the natural drainage gradient of the surrounding land. Roy absorbed this. You've looked into it. Thoroughly, she said. He nodded slowly, and she could see him doing the mental arithmetic that farmers do when new information changes the map of the local landscape, calculating adjacency, implications, what-if chains that stretched in several directions at once. Hank, who had been watching this exchange with his arms folded, said, You really think that bottomland will be farmable? I know the soil quality, she said. I've had it tested. When it drains, it's the best ground in the valley. Better than anything you're farming. She said it plainly, not as a provocation, but as a fact, the way Granger stated facts. Hank was quiet for a moment. Then, slowly, the set of his face changed. Not to the concern dressed as skepticism she'd been dealing with for months, but to something more straightforward. Something that might, with a favorable interpretation, be called respect. You need anything? He said. Materials-wise, for the next stage. She looked at him. What are you offering? Nothing for free, he said, with the clarity of a man who'd been a farmer his entire life and had no illusions about charity. But I've got 200 feet of field tile sitting in my barn from a drainage project I never finished. Good tile. If it's useful, you can have it at cost. She held his gaze for a moment. I may need it, she said. Let me know the price. I'll write it up, he said. 4 days after the backfill, she was standing at the edge of the bottomland in the early morning with coffee she'd brought in a thermos, watching. She'd been watching every morning. She was also watching for the cattails, the way Granger had told her to. For the first 3 days, nothing changed. The water sat where it always sat. The cattails stood straight. She'd checked the outlet extension twice from the upland end of its drainage path, looking for flow, and found nothing visible. On the 4th morning, she found flow. It was not dramatic. It was a thin, steady seep of dark water emerging from the ground at the base of the outlet extension, no more than a trickle, moving without urgency through the grass toward the ditch that led to Shale Branch. She crouched and put her hand in it, cold, moving, distinctly moving, with the particular quality of water that has pressure behind it rather than water that is merely sitting. She stayed crouched for a long time, longer than was probably necessary, with her hand in that thin, cold trickle of moving water, feeling something she didn't have a precise name for. She called Granger from the edge of the bottomland. It's running, she said when he picked up. A pause. How much? Not much. A trickle. But it's steady. That's right, he said. That's how it starts. The system is pressurizing. Give it 4 more days. Check the center water level every morning. drive a stake at the waterline, measure against it each day. She did. The first 2 days showed nothing measurable. On the third day, the stake showed a quarter-inch of drop. On the fourth, 3/4. On the fifth, the water had dropped 2.5 inches, and the cattails at the center of the bottomland were leaning just slightly, just perceptibly, the way Granger had said they would. She photographed the stake every morning. She noted the measurements in a notebook. She sent Granger the numbers by phone each evening, and he listened and said things like "good" and "as expected." And once, after a particularly strong drop of nearly an inch in a single day, the outlets fully opened. On the 8th day after backfill, the outlet was running clearly. Not a trickle anymore, but a genuine flow, dark and purposeful, cutting a new channel through the grass toward Shale Branch. She was standing there watching it when she heard the truck. She didn't recognize it immediately, a red pickup, older, with mud on the running boards, and she turned around with the alert wariness of a person who has spent enough time alone on a working farm to know that unexpected visitors require attention. The truck stopped on the farm road above the bottomland, and a man got out who she placed after a moment as Walt Tibbets, who farmed a quarter section on the valley's western ridge. She'd spoken to Walt Tibbets maybe 4 times in her life. He was a quiet man, methodical, with a reputation for doing things slowly and doing them right, which she'd always considered a fair way to be known. He walked down to where she was standing and looked at the outlet flow for a moment without speaking. "Hank told me," he said. "Told you what exactly?" "That you'd fixed the drainage." He paused. "That it was working." "It's working," she said. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the flow. Then he looked at the bottomland behind her. The flat expanse, still mostly underwater, but different now. The surface lower than it had been 2 weeks ago. The cattails at the center showing their bases where before only their tops had been visible. "My grandfather farmed that ground," he said, "before it flooded out." He paused. He talked about it sometimes. Said it was the best corn ground he'd ever worked. She looked at him. There was something in his voice that she hadn't expected. Not competitive, not the veiled assessment she'd gotten from Hank Dreyer at the feed store. Something older and more personal. "How long until it's farmable?" he asked. Granger estimates a full growing season for the ground to stabilize, which means planting the spring after next, at earliest. "This coming spring will be too early." He nodded. "That's about what I figured." He looked at the flow again. Then he said, "The old drainage system. Was the whole valley connected to it?" "Just the Holloway bottomland," she said. "The survey shows it was a private installation, not a county system." "Right," he said slowly. He was working toward something. She waited. "My east parcel," he said. "The low 40, at the bottom of the ridge. It's been wet for 30 years. My father tried to drain it twice, couldn't get it to work properly. A county engineer told him the problem was that the natural outlet for that ground used to run through the Holloway bottomland." He paused. "If your ground is draining properly now," she understood it immediately. If the Holloway bottomland was no longer ponding water, the hydraulic pressure that had been backing up into Tibbets's low east parcel, the water that had been piling up against the dam of standing water in the bottomland below it, with nowhere to go, would relieve. The water table in Tibbets's low 40 would drop on its own. "I don't know if that's what will happen," she said. "I can ask Granger." "I'd appreciate that," he said. She called Granger that evening. He listened and was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said. "The hydraulic connection is there. It's in the bore survey data from 1971. I didn't mention it because it wasn't relevant to the repair, but Tibbets's east ground feeds into the same groundwater system. If the Holloway drainage is functioning properly, that parcel should begin to drain naturally within 6 to 8 months." She thought about that. "There may be more," Granger said. "The valley's drainage is all connected. The bottomland was the lowest point, the plug, in a sense. With the plug removed, you may see effects on adjacent low ground across several parcels." "How widespread?" she said. "I'd have to map it," he said. "Give me a few days." July arrived and the valley dried out in the ordinary summer way, and the bottomland dried out in a way it hadn't done in 60 years. She could see it changing every day. The water level dropped steadily. Not quickly, never quickly, but with the persistence of a process that was now self-sustaining. The cattails thinned at the center as the water they depended on receded. Ground that had been permanently submerged began to surface, the soil dark and slick with moisture, but no longer underwater. Mudflats first, then firming ground that by mid-July she could walk on without her boots pulling. She walked every part of it. She took soil samples at 20 locations across the exposed ground and sent them to the state agricultural lab, along with the samples she'd taken in the dry perimeter areas where she could access the soil already. The results came back over 3 weeks, and when the full picture assembled itself, she sat at the kitchen table and looked at it for a long time. The soil in the central bottomland was better than anything the upland samples had shown. Organic matter content was exceptional. 60 years of decomposed vegetation incorporated into the soil structure, building something over decades that no tillage operation could replicate. The pH was slightly high from the prolonged saturation, which was correctable with a lime application. Phosphorus was low, which was expected. But the underlying quality, the texture, the organic content, the depth of the productive horizon was everything her grandfather's journal had described, and more. She called Granger and read him the numbers. He was quiet for a moment. "Your grandfather was right," he said. "He usually was," she said. "It just took a while to find out." "What are you going to do with it?" She'd been thinking about this. It was the question she'd been deferring, putting the soil tests ahead of it, the drainage data ahead of it, because it required a different kind of thinking than problem solving. It required planning. "Corn first," she said. 2 years of corn while the soil structure stabilizes and I work the pH down. Then rotate to soybeans and cover crops. Long term, I want to use the north 20 acres for specialty vegetables. The organic matter content is high enough that it would grow premium market produce with minimal inputs. "That's a good plan," Granger said. "I haven't planted it yet," she said. "No," he agreed. "But it's a good plan." The trouble came from the direction she'd least expected it. In the 3rd week of July, she received a letter. It arrived in a standard envelope with a Blackridge Valley return address she didn't recognize, a suite number on Commerce Street, which was the address of a law office in town. She opened it at the kitchen table. The letter was from an attorney named Patterson, representing someone named Harlan Vess, who was identified as the owner of a parcel adjacent to the Holloway bottomland on its western boundary. The letter stated that Mr. Vess believed the Holloway drainage project had materially altered the water table on his property, causing damage to his west pasture, and that he was considering legal action. She read it twice. Then she set it on the table and looked out the window. She knew the Vess parcel. She knew Harlan Vess, or rather she knew of him. He'd inherited the western parcel from his father about 8 years ago and had largely left it alone, running a few cattle on it with minimal investment and maintenance. She'd never had a conflict with him. She'd barely spoken to him. She called Granger. "Someone is claiming the drainage changed their water table," she said. "Which parcel?" "The Vess property, western boundary." A pause. "The Vess parcel is upslope from your bottomland," he said. "The drainage flow moves east to Shale Branch. There is no mechanism by which a drainage system in the Holloway bottomland can affect the water table on the Vess property. The hydraulic gradient runs the other direction." "You're certain?" "It's physics," he said. "I need that in writing," she said. "I'll write it up," he said. Give me 2 days." She called her sister. Ellen was quiet on the phone while Meredith read her the letter. "Do you have a lawyer?" Ellen said. "No." "Get one," Ellen said. "Not for the lawsuit. He may not even file. But to respond to the letter. You respond to something like this on your own, you can say the wrong thing without knowing it." "Lawyers cost money," Meredith said. "Meredith." "I know," she said. "I know you're right." She found an attorney through the County Bar Association, a woman named Carol Bright, who practiced general civil law out of an office in the next town over, and who, on the phone, had the quality Meredith had learned to value most in professional advisors. She said what she knew, said what she didn't know, and didn't fill the gap between the two with reassurance. "Is the engineering basis for this claim legitimate?" Carol said. "My engineer says no. He says the hydraulic gradient runs the other direction, and there's no mechanism for the drainage to affect the upslope parcel. Can he document that?" "He's writing it up now." "Good. Send it to me when you have it. My preliminary view, without having seen anything yet, is that a letter from an attorney claiming potential legal action is often exactly that, potential. Sometimes it goes further, sometimes it doesn't. Don't assume it means litigation. What do I do in the meantime? Document everything, Carol said. Photographs of the drainage, water levels, soil conditions, anything that establishes the state of your property and the adjacent properties before and after the work. Do you have that kind of record? She thought about the notebook she'd been keeping since April. The stake measurements, the photographs, dated, taken every morning, the soil test results. Yes, she said. I have a thorough record. Good, Carol said. Keep adding to it. Gerald Fitch called her the same week the letter arrived, which was coincidental timing that felt less than coincidental. I've heard there may be a legal issue, he said. He said it carefully, with the particular care of a man who had learned to be precise about the things he didn't know yet. There's a letter from an attorney, she said. Not a filed claim. My engineer has documented that the technical basis for the complaint is unsound. I see. A pause. The bank's position? Gerald, she said. She'd started using his first name sometime in the past 2 months. She wasn't entirely sure when. He hadn't objected. The bank's position is unchanged. I have documentation of the drainage project, the soil assessments, the engineering opinion. I have a lawyer advising me on the letter. This is a manageable situation. Another pause, slightly longer than the first. All right, he said. I appreciate the update. She hung up and sat for a moment in the kitchen. Outside, through the window, the afternoon was bright and hot, the kind of July day that pressed on everything. She could see the edge of the upper field, the fence line running true, the mules in the paddock standing in the shade of the barn, 20 animals that everyone had written off. 2 years of debt and doubt and a single, stubborn theory. 60 years of water, finally moving. She thought about Harlan Vess, who she'd never spoken to meaningfully, who now had his name on a letter that threatened to complicate everything she'd built. She thought about what Carol Bright had said. Document everything. She'd been doing that already, longer than anyone knew, and the habit her grandfather had passed on, without knowing he'd passed it on. The habit of writing down what you observed, what you measured, what you thought you knew and couldn't yet prove. She pulled the notebook toward her and wrote the date at the top of a new page. Then she started writing everything she remembered about the bottomland that day. The water level, the cattail coverage, the soil conditions in the areas she'd walked, the numbers from the outlet flow, the state of the path across the bottomland, which had firmed considerably as the surrounding ground drained. She wrote for an hour. When she was done, she closed the notebook and set it beside her grandfather's journal on the shelf, the two of them side by side, and sat for a moment looking at them. A letter from an attorney was a problem. Problems had the nature of problems. They arrived without invitation and demanded attention. But this one had arrived on solid ground, and she knew the ground was solid because she had measured it, photographed it, and had an 80-year-old engineer who could explain exactly why it held. She was not going to lose this. Not to water, not to debt, and not to a letter on a piece of paper from a man she'd barely met. She went out to feed the mules. Seven came to the fence as she approached, the way he always did. The first to move, the first to meet her, his watchful eyes tracking her across the yard with that particular steady attention that she'd come to think of as a kind of partnership. Still here, she told him. He pressed his nose against her arm. She scratched the base of his ear and stayed there while the evening came down over the valley, and the light went the long gold of a summer day ending, and the bottomland beyond the south fence lay quiet and slowly, steadily, draining itself into the earth. Carol Bright's response letter went out the second week of August. Meredith hadn't seen the final draft until Carol called her to read it over the phone. A professional habit, Carol had explained, when her clients weren't local. The letter was 3 paragraphs. It stated that the Holloway drainage project had been completed in accordance with sound engineering principles, that the technical basis for Mr. Vess's claim had been reviewed by a qualified drainage engineer whose written opinion was enclosed, and that Mrs. Holloway looked forward to resolving any legitimate concerns through appropriate channels, but was prepared to defend her position fully if necessary. It's firm without being aggressive, Carol said. You want to leave room for this to go away quietly. If it doesn't, we've established the record. All right, Meredith said. The engineering opinion is strong, Carol said. Granger's language is precise. He's clearly done this before. He knows how to write for a legal audience without overstating. He's been writing field reports for 40 years, Meredith said. He knows what precise means. It shows. A pause. I'll let you know when I hear back. Could be a week. Could be a month. Could be nothing. It was, in the end, closer to nothing. 3 weeks later, Carol called to say that Patterson's office had acknowledged receipt and indicated that Mr. Vess was reviewing the engineering opinion. There was no follow-up after that. The letter had been, as Carol had suggested it might be, a shot across the bow from a man who'd expected the other party to have no bow of their own. Meredith didn't celebrate. She just moved on. Woggy. August turned mean. It happened the way drought always happened in Black Ridge Valley. Gradually at first, then suddenly. The way a person doesn't notice they're getting dehydrated until they're already past the easy fix. The rains that normally came through in scattered thunderstorms through late July and early August simply didn't materialize. The creek dropped. The pastures went from green to yellow to the dull tan of dry grass that had stopped trying. Farmers on the ridge ground began talking about their wells, which was never a good sign. Meredith's upland fields were not immune. She'd put in soybeans on the East 40 and corn on the North Field, and both were showing stress by mid-August. The corn leaves rolling in the afternoons, the soybeans yellowing slightly along the margins. She walked the fields every day and made the calculations that dry year farming required. How much yield loss she was looking at, what the market prices were doing, how that translated against her operating costs and the restructured loan agreement she'd reached with Fitch in July. The restructured agreement had given her breathing room. She'd presented Fitch with the soil assessments, Granger's formal engineering opinion, the drainage data, and the photographic record, everything Carol Bright had told her to document, laid out in order, with a cover letter she'd written herself and revised 4 times. Fitch had read it over 3 days and called her back with a proposal. Extend the loan term by 18 months, at the current rate, against the increased property value represented by the newly productive bottomland acreage. The appraisal will take 4 to 6 weeks, he'd said, but based on what you've provided, I'm prepared to proceed on the assumption that the assessment will support the extension. That's not a guarantee, she'd said. No, he'd agreed. It's a reasonable basis for proceeding, which is the most I can offer you right now. She'd taken it. Now, standing in the north cornfield in the 3rd week of August with the stalks rustling in a dry, unhelpful wind, she thought about the difference between what she had and what she still needed. The loan extension bought time. The upland crop yields were going to be below expectations. How far below, she wouldn't know until harvest. The bottomland was still draining, still not plantable until spring, still producing nothing. The gap between where she was and where the plan required her to be was real, and a drought was not helping close it. She walked back to the barn. She fed the mules. She wrote numbers in the notebook until she'd worked through the worst-case calculations and found that even the worst case was survivable, which was the only kind of math she trusted. What she hadn't accounted for, what no one in the valley had accounted for, was what happened to the bottomland in a drought year. She noticed it first on a Tuesday morning, walking the bottomland perimeter the way she did every few days, checking the drainage progress, monitoring the soil conditions in the areas that had been exposed longest. The surrounding upland ground was cracked and dry. The creek was the lowest she'd ever seen it, but the bottomland soil, the dark exposed sections that had been underwater as recently as 6 weeks ago, looked different from everything around it. It looked moist, not wet, not the saturated soil of spring that squelched underfoot. Moist, the way good garden soil looks after a rain, that particular dark color that means moisture is being held rather than simply sitting. She crouched and dug her hand into it, 4 inches down. Cool. Distinctly cool. And damp enough that her hand came up with soil clinging to it in the way soil clings when it has moisture to give. She drove to Granger's house that afternoon. He opened the door before she knocked. He'd seen the truck from the window, probably, and looked at her face. Something wrong? No, she said. I want you to come look at something. He got his jacket. They stood at the edge of the exposed bottomland soil in the late afternoon, and she watched him crouch and do what she'd done that morning. Push his hand into the earth, feel the temperature, bring it up, and look at it. He was quiet for a while. The drainage changed the capillary structure, he said finally. Explain that to me. He stood, brushing the soil from his hand. When soil is permanently saturated, the pore spaces are always full of water. There's no capillary action because there's nowhere for water to move to. It's already everywhere. When you drain it, the pore structure opens up. The soil starts to function the way it was designed to function. He paused, looking at the field. Deep soil with high organic content acts like a sponge, but only when it's been allowed to dry and re-wet properly. Your bottomland soil has been saturated for 60 years. It's never had the chance to develop that function. Now it has, and the organic matter that's been building in there for 60 years is holding moisture at a depth that surface drought doesn't reach. She looked at the soil. So even without rain, the deep moisture is maintained by the water table, which hasn't dropped as much as the surface, and the organic matter is holding what's there. He looked at the surrounding upland. Your upland fields are suffering the same drought everyone else is suffering, but this ground, he gestured at the bottomland, is doing something different. If you'd planted it this spring as I advised you not to. I know, she said. Too early. Too early, he agreed. The soil structure wasn't stable yet, but next spring, he paused. Next spring, this is going to be drought resistant in a way that nothing else in the valley is. She stood with that for a moment. Does anyone else know this? She said. No one has been paying attention to this soil except you and me, he said. Harvest came in mid-September, and it came in the way she'd expected. Below projection, but not catastrophic, which was the best description for a drought year on upland ground. The soybeans came in at roughly 70% of a normal yield. The corn was better, to 80%, because the corn had gone in first and had deeper roots when the dry spell hit. She hired 2 seasonal workers for the harvest, men she'd worked with before and who knew her operation well enough to require minimal direction. And the 3 of them moved through it in 8 days of long work. She sold the soybeans at the elevator in town and held the corn, waiting for the price to improve, which it would, because drought years always tightened supply. She ran the numbers and found that she was where she'd calculated she would be in the worst case. Not comfortable, but not in trouble. That was when Roy Caulfield came to see her. He drove out on a Saturday morning without calling first, which she was noticing had become the local custom for people who wanted to ask her something they weren't sure she'd say yes to. He found her in the equipment barn working on the disc harrow, which needed a bearing replaced before she could use it on the bottomland the following spring. Roy, she said, without looking up from the bearing. You've got a minute? I've got 2, she said. She straightened up and wiped her hands on a rag and looked at him. He was carrying his hat, which he turned slowly in his hands, the universal gesture of a farmer who is about to ask something and has been rehearsing it on the drive over. The bottomland, he said. I heard from Walt Tibbetts that his east pasture is drying out better than it has in 20 years. That's right, she said. Granger predicted it. The hydraulic connection. Right. He turned the hat. My south field, the low end, where it meets your north boundary. It's been wet for as long as I can remember. Always the last to dry in spring. My father put tile in it twice and never got it right. She waited. Would Granger look at it? He said. Not for free. I'd pay for his time. I want to know if there's a connection to your system or if it's a separate problem. She thought about it for a moment. Then she said, ask him yourself. He's in the book. But Roy, be straight with him. Tell him exactly what you've told me. He doesn't respond well to people who come to him already knowing the answer they want. Roy nodded. That's fair. He turned the hat one more rotation. Your upland corn. I saw the harvest. Decent numbers for a drought year. Decent, she agreed. Mine were worse, he said, without self-pity, just as a fact. Ridge ground holds heat, but not moisture. The bottomland. That's what's going to make the difference in a year like this. Next spring, she said. Next spring, he repeated. He put his hat back on. I'll call Granger. October arrived, and with it the County Agricultural Extension Office. She'd been expecting them eventually. The drainage project had generated enough local conversation that sooner or later someone official was going to want to look at it. What she hadn't expected was the specific form it took. A phone call from a man named Dan Wexler, who identified himself as the Regional Soil and Water Specialist for the State Extension Service, and who asked if he could visit the property at her convenience. She said yes. Wexler arrived on a clear October morning with a colleague, a younger woman named Sarah Mott, who worked in agricultural soils research and who carried a camera and a sample kit and took measurements of everything without being asked. Wexler himself was a compact, serious man who asked questions the way engineers ask questions, specifically, in sequence, waiting for complete answers before proceeding to the next one. She walked them through everything: the journal, the survey, the tile system, the mule access route, the excavation and repair. She showed them the drainage outlet, now running clearly in the autumn rains, and the soil conditions across the exposed bottomland, and the stake record she'd kept since June. Wexler listened to all of it and then asked to see the soil test results. She brought out the folder. He went through the numbers carefully, making notes in a small spiral notebook. His colleague was still moving through the bottomland with her sample kit, pulling cores at various locations. "You said the organic matter content in the central sections was above 14%, Wexler said. "The lab results are in there," she said. 14.3% in the deepest core sample from the central area. He looked up from the folder. "That's exceptional. For comparison, well-managed agricultural soil in this region typically runs 3 to 5%. Certified organic operations working the same land for years might reach 6 or 7. 60 years of decomposition in anaerobic conditions," she said. Granger described it as a sponge that's never been allowed to function. "That's accurate," Wexler said. He looked at the bottomland. "And the drought performance you described, I can show you the comparison," she said. She went to the barn and brought out the notebook with the daily measurements. She'd been noting the upland soil moisture conditions alongside the bottomland readings since she'd noticed the difference in August, using a simple soil probe she'd bought at the farm supply. The comparison was clear even to a non-specialist. Wexler looked at the data for a long time. Then he looked at his colleague, who had finished her coring and was standing at the edge of the field with the kind of expression that scientists sometimes get when the field data matches the theory. "Mrs. Holloway," he said, "would you be willing to participate in a soil health documentation project? Nothing that would require anything of you beyond what you're already doing. We'd want to establish formal monitoring points, collect data over the next growing season, and, with your permission, publish the drainage methodology as a case study." She thought about it. "Would it affect my operation in any way?" "No. We'd work around your schedule. The monitoring equipment is passive. It wouldn't interfere with planting or harvesting." "All right," she said, "but I want to review anything you publish before it's finalized. And Elias Granger's name goes on it. He designed the repair." "Agreed," Wexler said. He made a note. "And the mule access methodology. That's part of what we want to document. There are other bottomland sites in this state with identical access problems. What you've worked out here may be applicable to those." She hadn't thought about that. She'd been so thoroughly inside her own specific problem, the specific junction, the specific path, the specific 20 animals, that the idea of it scaling outward, becoming something that other people in other places might use, hadn't fully formed in her mind. "Talk to Granger about the methodology," she said. "He understands the engineering basis better than I do." "We will," Wexler said. "You understood the access solution. That's yours." She told Granger about the extension visit that evening on the phone. He was quiet for a moment after she finished. "They want to publish it?" "As a case study, the drainage repair and the mule access method both." Another pause, longer. "Your grandfather's drainage analysis will be part of that." "I intend to make sure of it," she said. "His journal and the original survey are what made this possible. That's in the record." She heard him do something that might have been clearing his throat and might have been something else. When he spoke again, his voice was the same even, professional tone it always was. "All right," he said. "Tell Wexler I'll speak with him." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Elias, the 20 acres I promised you, I want to get that recorded before the end of the year, before the planting season." "That's not necessary yet," he said. "It's necessary to me," she said. "The work is done. The ground is yours." A pause. "I don't have the equipment to farm 20 acres. "You don't have to farm it," she said. "You can lease it back to me if you want, or leave it in cover crop, but it needs to be in your name." He was quiet for a long moment. She waited. "Fine," he said. "I'll call the county recorder." The first hard frost came in early November, which was about normal for Black Ridge Valley. and it settled the bottomland into its winter state. The exposed soil dark and firm now, holding the cold without freezing solid the way the clay-heavy upland ground did. She walked it one last time before the serious cold came, covering the full expanse of what had changed since spring. The transformation was not complete. She knew better than to think it was complete. The soil still needed a full growing season to establish the structure that sustained farming required. There were areas near the old pond margins where the ground was still too soft to work confidently, and those areas would need another season of drainage before she touched them with equipment. The pH correction hadn't happened yet. She'd applied lime in October, but it needed time and a winter's worth of soil chemistry to work. But standing in the November light with the frost coming off the ground in thin wisps, she could see what this was going to be. She could see the shape of it, the rows that would go in come April, the particular dark quality of the soil that meant every planted seed was starting with an advantage. 240 acres that had been writing nothing for 60 years, about to start writing something. She thought about her grandfather. She did that sometimes, standing in places that had mattered to him. She'd find herself wondering what he'd see if he were standing next to her. Whether he'd recognize what had been done with the thing he'd spent his life trying to solve. She thought he probably would. He'd been a practical man. He'd have wanted to know the yield numbers and the input costs and the drainage flow rate. He'd have asked about the mules, specifically about the mule that had found the path, the one with the watchful eyes. She'd retired 7 from heavy work in September, not because he was injured or incapable, but because she'd made herself a rule that the animals that had done the hardest work would not be pushed past what they'd given. He was in the paddock when she came back from the bottomland that afternoon, standing in the thin November sun with the particular stillness of an animal that has figured out its place in a situation and settled into it. She stopped at the fence. He walked over. "We're almost there," she told him. He put his nose against her hand. She stood there for a moment, letting him, with the frost still in the air and the bottomland behind her and the long winter ahead. Dale came out in December. She'd seen him a few times since summer, but not with the agenda-in-hand quality he'd had in those early spring visits when he'd stood at the paddock fence trying to talk her back from something she'd already decided. He came now without an agenda, or rather, with one that was different in character. He found her in the kitchen, where she was working through seed catalogs for the spring planting, making notes in the margin the way farmers do, circling varieties, writing prices, running quick math on population rates and row spacing. He sat down across from her. She put the coffee on without being asked. "I owe you something," he said, when she sat back down. "You don't owe me anything, Dale." "I told you you'd lost your mind," he said. "You told me you were worried," she said. "That's different." He looked at his hands on the table. He had Garrett's hands, broad, with the particular wear of a man who worked outdoors. She'd noticed that before, and it still caught her, occasionally, in a way she'd learned to let pass without getting tangled in. "I should have trusted you more," he said. "Maybe," she said, "but honestly, I wasn't sure myself. Not completely. I thought the idea was right. I didn't know the execution would hold." "When did you know?" he said. She thought about it. "When the water started running at the outlet," she said. "That 3rd or 4th day. When it went from a trickle to a real flow." She paused. "Before that, I thought it would work. After that, I knew." He nodded. He was quiet for a moment, turning his coffee mug. "Garrett would have been—" he started, and then stopped. She waited. "He would have been out there with you," Dale said. "In that hole. Digging." She smiled slightly, and it was a real smile, the kind that has some ache in it. "He would have been complaining about the mud," she said, "and then he'd have kept digging." Dale laughed. It was a short laugh, a surprised laugh, the kind that comes when something lands exactly right. They sat together for a little while after that, not talking much, with the seed catalog spread on the table between them and the December dark coming down outside the kitchen window. The drought that had hit Black Ridge Valley in August turned out to be the leading edge of a larger pattern. By December, the state agriculture department was projecting that the following year's growing season would be drier than average across the region. Farmers on the ridge ground were already adjusting their planting plans, pulling back on crops with high water requirements, shifting toward more drought-tolerant varieties. Wexler called in December with the preliminary data from the Extension Service's monitoring equipment, which had been installed on the bottomland in October. The moisture retention numbers confirmed what she'd seen in August. The deep soil profile was maintaining moisture at a level significantly above what the surface conditions would suggest. Even after a dry fall with well below average precipitation, the organic matter content was holding available water in the lower soil horizon at levels that would support crop growth through an extended dry period. The data is better than we expected, Wexler said. The drought resilience is real, and it's attributable to the specific soil profile rather than to any particular management practice. The organic matter content is doing exactly what the theory predicted, but the magnitude is higher. What does that mean for the case study? She said. It means the story is more interesting than we thought, he said. We'll have growing season data to include if you're able to plant as planned in April. I'm planting in April, she said. She was. On the last day of the year, she drove into town for supplies and ran into Hank Dreyer at the feed store, which was not unusual, and found him in a conversation with Walt Tibbetts and two men she recognized as farmers from the south end of the valley. They stopped when she came in, not in an unfriendly way, in the way of people who have been talking about the person who just walked in and who have run out of time to pretend they haven't. Meredith, Hank said. Hank. She set her list on the counter. Walt. Walt nodded. One of the other men, she placed him as Carl Rennick, who farmed a section along the south branch of Shale Creek, said, We were just talking about your bottomland. I know, she said. Carl Rennick had the grace to look slightly embarrassed. The drought numbers Wexler's office put out, the preliminary data. Some of us were looking at our own low ground and thinking about whether what you did down there might apply. She looked at the group of them. 4 men who had, at various points in the past year, expressed varying degrees of doubt about what she was doing. Not cruel doubt. There was nothing malicious in any of them. Just the ordinary doubt of people who have seen a lot of plans fail and have developed appropriate skepticism as a consequence. Talk to Granger, she said. He's the one who understands the engineering. Every piece of low ground is different. What applied to my bottomland may not apply to yours in the same way. Would he consult? Carl said. You'd have to ask him, she said. He doesn't work for free, and he shouldn't. He's worth more than most people in this valley have ever given him credit for. That sat for a moment. Fair enough, Hank said quietly. She finished her order and gathered her supplies. At the door, she stopped and looked back at them. 4 farmers standing in a feed store on the last day of a hard year, looking at her with the kind of attention that meant something had shifted in how they were calculating things. The drought next year is going to be bad, she said. Wexler's numbers suggest worse than this year. Ground that can hold moisture through that is going to matter more than anyone currently thinks it will. She pushed the door open. Happy New Year, she said, and walked out into the cold. April came cold and then warm, the way spring always moved through Black Ridge Valley. 2 steps forward, 1 step back, never quite committing until it did all at once. She planted the bottomland on the 14th. She'd been watching the soil temperature since the first week of March, pressing a thermometer into the ground at 5 locations across the field every morning before she did anything else, recording the numbers in the notebook beside the drainage measurements that had now become routine. Wexler had told her 50 degrees Fahrenheit at 4-inch depth was the threshold. She'd held herself to it strictly, even on the days when the weather looked right and her instinct said go, because she'd learned the hard way over the past year that her instinct and the soil's readiness were 2 different things, and the soil didn't care about her schedule. On the 13th, the average across all 5 locations was 51 degrees. She called Granger. Tomorrow, she said. The forecast looks clean, he said. Dry through the weekend. I know. How do you feel? He asked. She thought about it. The real answer, not the social one. Like I'm about to find out if everything I think is true actually is, she said. Yes, he said. That's about right. She didn't sleep well that night. Not from anxiety, exactly. She'd moved past the acute anxiety months ago, somewhere around the time the drainage outlet had gone from a trickle to a real flow. This was more like the feeling before something large and long prepared for finally arrives. The strange suspension of a person standing at the edge of a thing they've been walking toward for a very long time. She was in the field by 6 the next morning with the first light barely on the horizon, the soil dark and quiet under her boots, holding the cold of the night in its top inch and the deep warmth of drainage and organic matter below that. She walked the full length of the field before she brought any equipment in. An old habit, one she'd picked up from watching Garrett walk his fields before planting, his hands in his pockets, his eyes on the ground. The look of a man reading something written in a language most people never learned. She understood that language better now than she ever had. The planting took 3 days. She used the 4-row planter she'd rebuilt over the winter, a piece of equipment old enough to have a personality. It ran well when it ran and announced its displeasure with specific mechanical complaints that she'd learned to interpret. It ran well those 3 days. The soil opened cleanly in front of the openers, each furrow cutting at the right depth, the seed dropping at the spacing she'd calculated. She drove the rows slowly, watching the monitor, stopping twice to check depth by hand, finding it right both times. Wexler's colleague Sarah Mott came out on the second day and walked beside her for an hour while she worked, asking questions and taking photographs. She was easy company, curious without being intrusive, professional without being cold. "How does it feel?" Sarah asked, watching the planter work the black soil. "Ask me in October," Meredith said. Sarah smiled. "Fair enough." On the third day, she finished the last row in the early afternoon and drove the planter back to the barn and stood at the edge of the field for a while, looking at what she'd done. 212 acres planted. She'd left the 20 she'd deeded to Granger in cover crop at his request, which was his right. The rest was in corn, the long rows running straight across ground that hadn't seen a planted seed in 60 years. It didn't look like a revolution. It looked like a planted field. That was what she'd expected. The most important things generally looked like something ordinary until they didn't. The drought Wexler had predicted arrived in June and stayed. It was worse than the previous year, measurably, provably worse, documented by the weather station at the county extension office in weekly reports that painted an increasingly clear picture of a region under serious moisture stress. The creek dropped to levels that old-timers said they'd only seen twice before in memory. Farms on the ridge ground began to show it by July. Fields that had been green going brown at the edges, then across the center, the corn leaves rolling tight in the afternoons, a sure sign of a plant rationing what it had. Meredith's upland fields were suffering too. She was honest about that. She didn't pretend the drought was someone else's problem. The north cornfield was going to come in short, and she'd adjusted her yield estimates accordingly, running the numbers against the loan balance and finding still that she was all right. The extension on the loan held. The upland losses were real, but not fatal. What was happening in the bottomland was something different. She hadn't told anyone yet. She was still measuring, still collecting the daily data for Wexler's monitoring project, still being careful not to call something before she had the numbers to back it up. But she walked the bottomland every morning, and she could see it with her eyes before she ever looked at the instruments. The corn was green, not just surviving, growing, the way corn is supposed to grow when it has what it needs. Taller than the upland corn by 6 inches by mid-July, the leaves broad and flat rather than rolled, the color a deep, strong green that was startling against the dry brown of the valley's surrounding hillsides. Wexler drove out on the 22nd of July and stood in the field for a long time without saying much. "The moisture retention at 12 inches is 22%, he said, reading from the monitoring station data on his tablet. The upland reference site is at 7% unsung. I've been watching it since June, she said. He looked at the corn. This is going to be a complete growing season data set, he said. Planting through harvest, drought year, direct comparison between the restored bottomland and the surrounding upland ground. He paused. This is the data we didn't know we were going to get when we set up the monitoring project. Is it useful? She said. He looked at her with the expression of a scientist who has just been asked if water is wet. It's more than useful, he said. If the yield numbers at harvest match what the plant health is suggesting, if this field comes in at anywhere near normal yield in a drought year where the surrounding farms are at 50 or 60%, it changes the conversation about what bottomland restoration can mean for regional food security. She hadn't thought about it in those terms. She'd been thinking about her own farm, her own loan, her own 200 acres. The larger frame, what it meant for a region, what it meant for other bottomlands sitting underwater and unused across the state, had been in the background, something she was aware of without it being the thing she was working toward. But standing in the field in July, with the drought bearing down and the corn standing green and strong around her, she felt the larger frame settle into place. Not as ambition. She'd never been a person motivated by scale for its own sake. More as a recognition. The things she'd done had edges that extended beyond her fence line, and those edges mattered to people she hadn't met yet. Harlan Vess came to see her in August. He drove in unannounced, the way everyone did, and she met him at the gate with the particular alertness she reserved for unexpected visitors whose last communication had been a lawyer's letter. He was older than she'd pictured him, mid-60s, with a weathered face and the careful movements of a man who'd spent his life outdoors and was starting to feel the accumulated cost of it. He held his hat in front of him with both hands. "Mrs. Holloway," he said, "I expect you know why I'm here." "I have a guess," she said. He looked at the ground for a moment. "The letter from Patterson," he said. "That was my mistake. I got nervous when the water table shifted on the west pasture, and I listened to someone who told me I had a claim." He paused. "The claim was wrong. I understand that now. I had Granger's engineering opinion explained to me by a second engineer at my own expense. The drainage couldn't have caused what I was seeing." "No," she said, "it couldn't. What I was seeing," he said slowly, "was my own pasture finally getting drier than it's been in 20 years. Which is an improvement, not a complaint." He stopped. "I owe you an apology for the letter. It cost you time and money you didn't have." She looked at him. He met her eyes, and there was no performance in it, no calculation, just the discomfort of a man doing something he'd put off longer than he should have. "I appreciate you coming to say that," she said. She meant it. An apology delivered in person, without being required to, was worth something real. "The letter is behind us. Let's leave it there." He nodded. "Your bottomland corn," he said, glancing toward the south field. "I drove past it on the way in. It's something." "It is," she said. "My grandfather used to talk about this valley," he said, "about what it was before the drainage failed." He paused. "I think I understand better now what he was talking about." She thought about her own grandfather, about the journal and the careful handwriting and the 30 years of trying to solve a problem he'd never gotten to finish. She thought about how much of what we inherit isn't land or money, but the shape of an unfinished problem, handed to us without instruction. "Our grandfathers would have had something to talk about," she said. He put his hat back on. "Yes," he said. "I think they would." Harvest came in the first week of October. She brought in the bottomland corn over 4 days, and she did the yield calculations herself by hand, in the notebook, the night after the last load went to the elevator. She sat at the kitchen table where she'd sat 2 years ago, with the phone call that had changed everything, with the pot of beans on the stove and the evening light ordinary and indifferent, and she did the math. The bottomland corn had come in at 94% of the county average yield for a normal year, in a drought year that had cut surrounding farms to 55 and 60%. She set the pen down and sat with that number for a while. Outside, the October night was quiet, with that particular country quiet that isn't really silence but the absence of anything requiring attention. Crickets still going in the dry grass, the faint sound of one of the mules shifting in the barn. She called Granger. 94%, she said, when he picked up. A long pause. "In this drought year," he said. "Yes." She heard him exhale, but not dramatically, just the long, slow breath of a man who has been holding something for a long time and is only now putting it down. "Your grandfather was right about the soil," he said. "He was right about most things," she said. "He just needed the drainage to prove it." "And the drainage needed the mules," Granger said. "And the mules needed someone stubborn enough to believe they could walk where tractors couldn't," she said. A short silence. Then Granger said, with the closest thing to warmth she'd ever heard in his voice, "I'd call it persistent rather than stubborn." "I'll take it," she said. Wexler published the case study in November in the State Extension Service's Agricultural Research Journal. It ran 9 pages with maps, soil data, drainage diagrams, and yield comparisons. The methodology section credited Elias Granger's drainage engineering and Edgar Holloway's original soil analysis. She'd insisted on both, and Wexler had included them without argument. The section on the mule access method ran 2 full pages, with photographs. There was one photograph that Sarah Mott had taken in May, from a distance, showing Meredith walking the path across the bottomland with the team behind her. 20 animals in single file, moving over waterlogged ground that had turned away every machine anyone had tried, following a line that nothing with wheels could find. She looked at that photograph for a long time when the journal arrived. It didn't look heroic. It looked like a woman walking her animals across a muddy field. That was the truth of it. The whole thing, from the day she'd bought 20 unwanted mules to the day she'd pulled 94% yield out of a drought year, had mostly looked like work. Had mostly been work. The drama was there, yes. The letter from the lawyer, the failed outlet, the listing sled runner, the cold cornbread eaten at the bottom of a 9-foot hole. But underneath all of it, under all the things that could have gone wrong, and sometimes did, was just the daily accumulation of someone showing up and doing what the situation required. She'd learned something about herself in the past 2 years that she hadn't known she needed to learn. She was not a person who needed certainty to act. She needed a reasonable theory and the willingness to be wrong without letting the possibility of being wrong stop her from moving. Most people, she thought, stopped before they started. Not because they lacked the ability, but because the gap between what they could see clearly and what they were being asked to risk was too wide, and they couldn't find a way to cross it on the available information. Her grandfather had stood at that same gap for 30 years. He'd had the theory. He'd had the knowledge. What he hadn't had was the willingness, or maybe the desperation, because the two were sometimes the same thing, to step forward without knowing for certain that the ground would hold. She'd had the desperation. The bank loan and the debt and the 2 years of widowhood and the farm that needed her to do something had provided that much for free. But she thought sometimes that the desperation was only the starting point. You could be desperate and still turn back. The thing that kept her walking forward into the swampy ground and the excavation and the legal threat and the drought year was something quieter than desperation. It was the particular stubbornness of a person who has looked at a problem from enough angles to believe, not know, just believe, that it is solvable, and who is not willing to walk away until they've tested that belief against reality. Reality had this time agreed with her. It didn't always. She was aware of that. There were other people in other places who had believed just as hard in a theory that turned out to be wrong, and they hadn't been saved by their believing. The difference between her and those people was partly skill, partly Granger's expertise, partly her grandfather's 30 years of careful observation. But partly it was luck. The simple dumb luck of the path being where she'd thought it was, of the junction being intact, of the drought arriving in exactly the year that made the bottomland's performance visible against the surrounding landscape. Take any one of those away, and the story was different. She didn't pretend otherwise. She held the success for what it was, real, earned, and also contingent on things she hadn't controlled. Gerald Fitch called in November, a week after the case study was published. The appraisal came in, he said. How did it look? It looked, he said, and she could hear something different in his voice. Not the careful professional neutrality she'd been navigating for 2 years, but something with a quality she might describe as sheepish, considerably better than the preliminary estimate. How much better? He gave her the number. She wrote it down and looked at it. That clears the loan, she said. With a significant margin remaining, he said. Mrs. Holloway, I want to say something. All right. The bank's position at the beginning of this, the calls, the pressure, that was appropriate given the information we had at the time. I want you to understand that. He paused. But I also want to say that you were right and I was wrong about what the property could be, and that matters. It does, she said. I appreciate you saying it. After she hung up, she sat for a while. The number she'd written down was large enough that it changed things. Not just the loan, but the next 3 years. The equipment she could upgrade. The additional bottomland acreage she could put into production. The operating cushion she'd been farming without since Garrett died. She should have felt the full weight of that relief. And she did. But it came mixed with something that surprised her. A kind of gratitude that wasn't directed anywhere in particular, just a free-floating awareness of how many things had had to go right, and how many people had been part of it going right, and how different the story would have looked if any of them had been absent. Elias Granger, who had opened the door when she knocked, and who had brought his grandfather's knowledge, and his own 40 years of work to a problem everyone else had written off as solved by neglect. Ellen, who had sat at the kitchen table and said, "Tell me," and meant it. 20 animals that nobody wanted, who had walked where nobody believed they could walk, who had found the path in the ground that everything depended on. And her grandfather, who had spent 30 years sitting with the problem and writing it down carefully so that one day, when someone came along who needed it, the knowledge would be there. She drove out to Granger's property on a Saturday in late November, the bare trees standing against a sky the color of old metal, the fields around her stripped to their winter form, the honest structural form of land without its seasonal cover, everything reduced to what it actually is. He was working in the garden when she arrived, which struck her as typical. The vegetable beds were being put to rest for winter. She could see he'd been turning the last of the soil, incorporating the season's dead plant matter the way a gardener does when they're thinking about next spring already. He looked up when she got out of the truck. Waited. She walked over and stood at the edge of the garden and looked at what he'd done to his 20 acres. He'd put it in a cover crop mix, a blend of winter rye, clover, and hairy vetch, and it had come up clean and green, the kind of deliberately managed fallow that was better for the soil than any cash crop would have been in a first year. "That's good ground management," she said. "I know how to manage ground," he said. She smiled at that. They stood there for a moment, looking at the field. The cover crop moved slightly in the cold wind, green against the gray November day. "The case study," she said. "Have you heard anything?" "2 calls," he said. "One from a drainage engineer in the south part of the state, one from the University Agricultural Department, both asking about the methodology." "What did you tell them?" "I told them the methodology is documented in the published paper and that I'd be willing to consult on specific projects for a reasonable fee." "Good," she said. He looked at her sideways. "Your mule access method generated more interest than my drainage repair." "Your drainage repair is the part that actually matters," she said. "They're both necessary," he said. "That's the point of it. Neither one works without the other." She looked at the cover crop, at the fine green texture of it against the dark soil, and she thought about that. 2 things that only work together: the path through the ground and the knowledge of what lay beneath it, the access and the repair, the patience to earn the animal's trust and the engineering to understand what they were hauling toward. You could have any one of those pieces and get nowhere. You needed all of them, assembled in the right order by people willing to do the unglamorous work of preparation before they ever got to do the thing the preparation was for. Most people wanted to skip to the part that looked like a result. She understood the impulse. The result was what you could show people, what you could point to, what you could put in a photograph in a journal. The 9 months of daily measurement and the 11 days of path repacking and the 3 hours of hand-clearing debris from a broken clay outlet 9 feet underground, those didn't make good photographs. But they were the story. They were all of the story that actually mattered. Spring came again. She planted the bottomland for the 2nd year in late April. Corn again, a different hybrid this time, better suited to the specific soil profile that Wexler's lab had characterized over the previous growing season. The planting went faster than the first year because she knew the ground now, had the feel of it, understood where it was uniform and where it needed adjustments in depth or population. Seven walked with her along the field edge while she made the final checks before planting, which wasn't something she'd planned or trained. He simply came when she opened the paddock gate, following her the way he'd followed her across the bottomland the first time. That first morning in May, when she'd unlatched him and brought him to the edge of something uncertain and let him decide. She walked the full perimeter of the field with him, the sun coming up over the eastern ridge, and the soil dark and ready under the morning light. At the far end of the field, she stopped. She thought about her grandfather walking this same ground at the end of his life, knowing what was underneath it, knowing what it could be, not quite finding the way to get there. She thought about the particular sadness of a person who can see the answer but can't reach it, the problem sitting just beyond the length of your arm for 30 years. She didn't know if she would have found the way, if the circumstances had been different, if Garrett had still been alive, if the bank hadn't been pressing, if she hadn't been backed into a corner where the mules were the last idea she had. She liked to think she would have. She wasn't sure. What she knew was this: the desperation had gotten her started, but it hadn't kept her going. What had kept her going was the thing her grandfather had put in her without knowing he was doing it: the habit of observation, of recording, of trusting what she could measure over what she was told. The habit of believing that a problem left unsolved is still a solvable problem, and that the person who picks it up next is not obligated to accept the verdict of everyone who put it down before them. The ground gives back what you understand how to ask for. That was the thing she'd learned. Not the drainage engineering. Granger knew that better than she ever would. Not the mule handling. She was competent, not masterful. What she'd learned was how to hold a problem with patience rather than force, how to go around rather than through, how to look at what everyone else had written off and ask a different question. Not why won't it work, but what would it need in order to work? Seven turned and started back toward the barn, the way he always did when he'd decided a walk was finished. She followed him. Behind her, 212 acres of the best ground in Black Ridge Valley waited for the season. It had been waiting a long time. It was done waiting now.